I drove away from the campus with a hollow in my chest I couldn't name. He'd waved, of course, my grandson always waved like he believed the whole world would answer back. I told myself I'd be fine. I told myself that giving him a shot at distance was the kind thing to do. I told myself a lot of things that night, and every one of them sounded thin the moment the house keys turned in my pocket. When I pushed open his bedroom door to make sure I hadn't left any of his things behind, my eyes caught the underside of the old second-hand desk, a sliver of paper, taped there like a secret shrine. I pulled it free with fingers that felt colder than they should for July. The handwriting was small and deliberate, the kind you teach a child when you tell them how to make words soft. Grandpa, if you're reading this, it means they finally succeeded. The sentence didn't just land on me. It landed in me. It rolled around inside my ribs, knocking loose memories I'd stacked carefully like plates, my wife humming at the sink, birthdays with too much cake, the nights I worked a second shift so he could have shoes that didn't leak. I read the next lines and the room stopped. You are not safe. They listen. They watch. Don't trust the people living under your own roof. The words were simple. They were terrifying. They were the kind of truth a child carries because he thinks a grown man can fix anything if only he knows about it. I sat on the edge of his bed with the note in my hand until the house stopped moving. For the first time in years, I felt small in a way that wasn't about age or bones. It was a new kind of smallness, the kind that happens when the ground underneath you is paper thin and someone else has already started tearing it away. Before I tell you everything my grandson discovered, please, hit subscribe. If you've ever trusted your family and felt that trust fray, you owe it to yourself to hear the rest. I folded the note carefully, like it was the last thing fragile in the world, and I kept thinking, he's a college kid. Why would he write this? Who are they? And how could a boy who still left his socks in a basket know more about the people I loved than I did? That first night, the house felt different. Not wrong exactly. Just, listening. The drive back from the college should have been an hour of quiet relief. Instead, every mile brought a new line of thought, each one sharper than the last. I replayed the note until it became a record stuck on the same small groove. On the way home, I stopped at the grocery store and bought the same tea my wife liked, the one that made the kitchen smell like Sunday. Habit is a dangerous thing when your life is starting to tilt. Habits are the scaffolding we lean on, and tonight the scaffolding rattled. My hands kept finding the steering wheel the way they had when my boy was small and I'd take him to the park. Little things, automatic things, as if my body insisted on the life I thought I still owned. I scolded myself for feeling foolish. They, whoever they were, could be an ex, a bully, a prank. But the note's tone didn't read like a child's joke. It read like a warning issued with the cold calm of someone who'd watched the pieces fall into place. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the windows were dark and the porch light had the tired glow of an old lamp whose switch had been flicked 1,000 times. The house that had once been loud with Christmas and arguments and the slow music of a long life felt like a stranger's. The silence in it had weight. I set the bags down, and somewhere between the sugar and the tea bags, the small acts of my life grounded me. I told myself I'd check on him and then go to bed. I told myself I'd toss the note into the wastebasket and sleep. And I told myself, again, a lie, it's probably nothing. The lie hung in the air long after the kettle began to boil. I didn't know then that the nothing I'd hoped for was the exact thing that would cost me everything. The house has fingerprints in its timbers. You can feel the years in the way the banister's varnish goes slick where hands rubbed 1,000 times, in the soft edge of the kitchen table where elbows always sat. Tonight, the marks felt accusing. Every chair seemed slightly out of place. A coaster not where it belonged. Linda's favorite teacup on the wrong shelf. Nothing huge, nothing a relative unfamiliar with our small rituals would notice, only a careful, patient rearrangement that reads like a map you didn't know you were following. I walked through room after room, hearing the echoes of the life we'd built. There, the sun-faded chair where Margaret knitted, there, the shelf of old novels she promised we'd reread together. I ran my hand along the mantel and felt the faint heat of an afternoon that had been long ago. Home is a collection of small certainties. Tonight those certainties were frayed, the way a sweater unravels when you find a snag. In the study, my refuge, someone had left a lamp on, which should have been impossible. I always switched it off. Always. The folder with the original deed should have rested under the ledger where I kept it. But someone had moved it. The top corner looked like it had been handled. Not rough handling, the gentle but thorough motion of someone who knows the surface and wants the thing inside. It's the small things that erode you. Not a single hammer blow, just 1,000 soft nudges until the wall gives. Hook, the house felt watched. And in the quiet between my heartbeats, I realized the danger might be waiting in the rooms I'd always trusted. The last week before he left is a film I watch in detail sometimes, trying to find the cut where everything went different. He had been home for the weekend. He'd come by to say goodbye. Not showy, just dropping off dishes and laughing about a professor who lectured too fast. In his pockets, he still carried the coin I had given him for good luck. I'd ruffled his hair the way I do and told him to call before he drove anywhere in the snow. He'd grinned, the same grin my daughter used to have when she was 10 and stole cookies when she thought I wasn't looking. But there were moments. A pause where his smile didn't reach his eyes. A late night when I heard him whispering into his phone and tucking it under the blanket like he didn't want anyone to see. I chalked it up to college nerves. You don't think of secrets when the boy you raised still asks you how to tie a tie. The night before his plane left, he hesitated at the door. "Grandpa," he said, and for a second he looked older than I expected. He handed me a wrapped pencil case and said, "Keep this for me. It's from Mrs. B, she says it will help you with your accounts." He laughed afterward like it was a joke. I laughed with him. I tucked the case in my pocket like a charm. Later that night, I found the note he'd taped under the desk. I thought, at first, of the kid who used to sleep with his stuffed penguin tucked under his chin. I couldn't reconcile the image with the small, hardened handwriting. How does a young man learn to speak in the tones of warning? How does he know when to hide his words under a desk like contraband? The past week's ordinary moments suddenly looked like rehearsals for something else, and the applause belonged to people I'd never suspected. After the note, I found myself listening to the house as if it were a second person. I'd sit in the chair by the window with a mug cooling in my hand and watch the street, neighbors, the paper boy, Mrs. Rojas walking her dog. Everyone moved with their own quiet rituals, oblivious to what was winding in our walls. The phone calls began small. A neighbor asking after my health in a way that felt perfunctory. A bill collector who called twice on an account I thought set up years ago. My son, checking in more than usual, his voice that used to have my father's steady hum now had a hurried cadence. At first, these were annoyances you wave away. But annoyance becomes fear when your life is hollowed out into pieces you can name. One call in particular gnawed at me, a recorded message about a change in beneficiary forms. Wrong department, wrong tone, but the name it mentioned, my name, printed like a price tag, made the skin on my arms prickle. I started taking photographs of folders where I found them. An inventory of my own life. I made lists the way a man might count his tools before walking a long job. Papers, signatures, dates. Who had access? Who had copies? Who had the ability to rewrite the story of my life? At night, when the house settled, I would sometimes climb the stairs and put my ear against my grandson's door. He slept like a child most nights, breath slow and even. Other nights, especially after he'd been on the phone, he would flinch in his sleep and I'd see the line between boyhood and something else, worry maybe, etched in the small movements of his hands. I realized then that unease isn't a single feeling. It's a drum. It gathers rhythm. It beats louder until the house answers in fear. Unease marched through the house like a polite but relentless visitor. And in its wake, I found the shape of an intention. Late that night, when the air outside cooled and the lights in neighboring homes went out like snuffed candles, I returned to the study. The lamps glow through a pocket of gold across the desk where I kept my deeds and the ledger. My hand found the fold where the deed should sit. It was gone. At first my breath caught in a way I blamed on age. I checked the drawer where I kept other papers. Nothing. The folder had been taken out and set somewhere. Someone had been here. Someone who knew where things lived. It was the little metallic glint near the back of the desk that sealed a reality I was trying not to own. A small black device, affixed with a screw to the underside of the wood. A tiny red light pulsed like a heart. A recorder. The thought of someone listening to me, listening to what I said about my wife's garden, about jokes we'd told, about instructions for fixing the leaky drain, felt obscene. The recorder wasn't a random instrument. It was an intention, to gather my life into files and use it like a map. My grandson had been right. The house had been turned into a stage. I'd been the performer unaware that someone took notes. I sat there for a long time with the device in my palm, hands shaking. I thought of calling the police. I thought of smashing it. But decisions made from panic are poor decisions. I tucked the device into my jacket pocket like contraband and walked it to the kitchen where the kettle was still humming. I boiled water until the whistle blurred into static. I needed thinking time more than action. I kept the recorder because I needed proof before I moved. Proof was a cold thing, but without it, I would only have suspicions and a shrinking life. With it, I had a shred of truth. Margaret used to say, sometimes people show you who they are with their hands before their mouths say it. She had an unerring eye for slights, for small cruelty. Watching the house that night, I could hear her in the way I noticed the smallest of betrayals. I could hear her in the way I checked the door twice before bed, in the way I read notes twice to make sure the handwriting didn't belong to someone else. She had been practical about money. I had been practical about building. We kept each other steady. Those small, everyday decisions were how we built a life that could be passed on. I had always assumed that would be the way my story ended, with the things I made and the love I gave resting in the hands of people who would keep them. Margaret had, more than once, said that children are mirrors, sometimes polished and sometimes cracked. She had told me, with that slow steadiness that always calmed me, that people sometimes do the unthinkable when hunger, shame, or greed takes over. I'd heard it and nodded, but it had been a lesson she gave gently, as if it were a map we didn't expect to consult. If she'd been alive, I think she would have searched faces the way I now searched the house, careful, patient. She would have said, listen to the quiet, and the quiet would have answered. She would have told me not to let fear push me into revenge, but to let it push me into strategy. I told the recorder about her that night, quietly, into the small red eye. I told it of her laugh, of the way she saved napkins for company, of the first summer we bought the house. If someone was listening, they would know I was an old man with a stubborn heart and stories. If that made them underestimate me, they had a mistake they would soon regret. Margaret's voice lived in the margins of everything I did afterward. She was the compass that kept me from drifting between panic and reaction. People change slowly. Betrayal, for most of us, comes like frost, quiet at first, then bitter. Looking back, the oddities were small, a call about for my own good, doctor appointment, my son offering to help me sign some papers, because it all sounded routine, a cousin who suddenly offered to help with finances, and then asked for access to my online accounts. Each event could have been an overreach born of concern. Taken together, they formed something more sinister. There was the way my daughter-in-law began to use certain phrases I'd never heard her use, for your safety, we'll handle it, it's better this way. Words chosen for their softness, designed to anesthetize a man into compliance. Her perfume became as familiar as a clock chiming at 2 in the morning. She would come in with casseroles and a smile and look at my mail the way someone eyes a ledger. My son, my boy, had been the boy who held my hand in the rain and told me he'd take care of me. The man who sat across from me at Thanksgiving with his shoulders back and his watch gleaming was not the same boy. He had learned the posture of responsibility and the language of gentle concern, but under that was a different grammar. The requests increased. Could he sit with me while I filled out forms? Could I let him use my email to update contact details? Reasons that sounded reasonable if you were the sort of person who wanted to help an aging father. Dangerous if you had other goals. One afternoon, I found a draft of an estate update on the kitchen counter, my signature on the bottom corner, the name of a lawyer I didn't recognize. I asked him where it came from. He told me it was standard paperwork, his colleague suggested. "We'll get it cleared," he said, and his voice had the same tones my dad used when he smoothed things I couldn't see. The pattern was what disturbed me. People who plan such things don't rush. They slow walk their scheme, normalization, incrementalism, then finality. A month of small requests becomes a legal form signed over a cup of coffee. Worse was the way their eyes shifted when I lifted my gaze, the look of people who are afraid of being caught rather than the look of people who have done nothing wrong. It is the tell. A twitch at the corner of the mouth, a glance away. I noticed it like a bruise. And in the smallest, most vicious of ways, my grandchildren felt it too. Anna, my granddaughter, began to visit less. When she did come, she came like someone who wanted to test the air for danger. I found an open notebook once with a page torn out and her handwriting practiced like a prayer. When I asked, she shrugged and said, "Homework." She lied like a child who has learned silence keeps peace. It is a strange and terrible thing to catalog your own family as if you were a detective. I didn't want to do it. But when your life becomes evidence, you learn to make inventory. The discoveries are small, the adjustments subtle, but the map was drawing itself. Someone in my house had screwed a listening device under my desk. Documents had been moved. Soft words had started to sound like a script. By the time the kettle stopped whistling in the night, I had a recording in my pocket, names in my head, and a small boy's note folded in my jacket. I had proof. And proof, in this house, could be a weapon or a shield. 2 days after finding the recorder, I walked into the kitchen and saw a stack of neatly arranged envelopes on the table, envelopes I hadn't placed there. Each one bore my name in careful blue ink. At first glance, they looked harmless, the way poison sometimes hides in sweetness. When I opened the first envelope, a cold flush climbed my spine. A change of beneficiary form. My name listed as grantor. My son's name typed where my wife's once was. And the signature at the bottom. Mine. Except it wasn't. The loops were too clean. The angle wrong. The boldness unfamiliar. Someone had practiced my handwriting. My hands tightened around the paper. I hadn't felt that kind of shaking since Margaret's funeral. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a mistake. This was a man-made redesign of my existence. I scanned the next envelope. Then the next. Each document followed the same pattern. Property transfer drafts. Banking access requests. Medical decision authorizations. Retirement reallocations. All unsigned. All pre-filled. All waiting for my cooperation. A script written long before I'd known it was being rehearsed. I sat down at the table. The chair felt wrong beneath me, as though the house was shifting to accommodate a new narrative I hadn't agreed to live in. I stared at those papers until the clock chimed 10. Then I asked myself 2 things. 1. Who created these documents? 2. How long had they been planning this? And the answer to both questions hit like a hammer. Long enough to be confident I wouldn't fight back. That realization tasted bitter. Not because of the betrayal, though that hurt deep enough to ache in the bones. But because they thought I wouldn't see the truth. That age had softened me into something malleable. Something forgetful. Something convenient. A liability. I gathered the papers, slid them into a folder, and placed it inside the old toolbox Margaret had given me for our 10th anniversary, the one no one else ever touched. It wasn't fear guiding me anymore. It was preparation. If you're still here and you understand what it feels like when the walls of your own home begin to shift against you, subscribe. More people need to hear truths families hide too well. It happened at 8:14 that night. My phone rang. Unknown number. Local area code. I normally wouldn't pick up. But instinct, or dread, nudged my hand. Hello. I said. Silence. Long enough to hear my own breath echo. Then a voice. Low. Controlled. You shouldn't have moved the papers. The kitchen felt cold all at once. My grip tightened around the phone. I stood, scanning the windows as if voices leave footprints on glass. Who is this? I asked. More silence. Then. You made things harder for everyone. Just let the process finish. It's for your benefit. Those last 4 words, for your benefit, were the same words my son had used last week. The exact same cadence. I didn't speak. I listened. The voice continued. You're not thinking clearly anymore. Let the people who love you help. Don't make this worse than it already is. Click. The call ended. Just like that. My pulse hammered in my neck. Not fear, recognition. Whoever called had connections to my family. They knew about the papers. They knew I'd moved them. They knew I wasn't playing the role they'd written for me. I replayed the voice in my head, line by line. Was it my son? No. The tone was younger, mid-30s maybe. Polished. Practiced. A lawyer. An associate. Someone hired to shepherd me into compliance. It struck me then. They weren't just planning to take control. They were preparing to justify it. A man who isn't thinking clearly is easy to discredit. Easy to overrule. Easy to declare incapacitated. And then I remembered the note. They watch. My grandson had known something I didn't. He had heard things. Seen things. Or worse, someone had tried to use him as a bridge to get to me. I sank into the chair slowly, my mind working faster than my old bones felt comfortable with. Someone expected me to be silent. Someone expected me to be powerless. They were about to learn I was neither. The next morning, I went outside to pick up the paper, not because I needed news, but because routine calms a man when his world starts rearranging itself. As I bent down, I noticed my neighbor, Henry, standing by his mailbox. A widower like me. Kind eyes. We'd shared beers on summer evenings, traded tools, fixed fences together. But today, Henry didn't wave. He walked toward me with careful, measured steps. "Tom, you got a minute?" he asked. I nodded. "You okay?" he asked. "Why?" I asked too quickly. He hesitated, rubbed the back of his neck, then sighed. "Look. I didn't want to get involved. But your family's been coming over here. Your son. Your daughter-in-law. Sometimes your cousins." My jaw tightened. "What for?" Henry shifted uncomfortably. "They asked if I'd noticed anything off. If you were wandering at night. Forgetting things. Leaving the stove on. Stuff like that." A cold anger stirred in my gut. "I never asked them to do that," I said quietly. He nodded. "I know. That's why I'm telling you." He paused. Then he said the part that sent fresh heat up the back of my neck. "They asked me to call them if I ever noticed you struggling. Said they were setting up a medical evaluation. Said you needed help, whether you realized it or not." Medical evaluation. The phrase crawled under my skin. That wasn't a checkup. That was the first step in a legal takeover. Power of attorney. Guardianship. Conservatorship. Henry lowered his voice. I didn't say anything to them. But Tom. Be careful. They weren't talking like people who want to help. They were talking like people who already decided something. For a moment, the world around us, the lawns, the trees, the quiet suburban peace, felt like a set piece. A backdrop. Something staged around a truth that most men don't talk about. Family can bury you without ever touching a shovel. I thanked Henry, though my voice cracked. I walked back into my house with the paper under my arm, but I didn't read a single word of it. Because the quiet warning in my grandson's note had just been confirmed by a man with nothing to gain and no reason to lie. They watch. The watchers weren't strangers. They weren't criminals. They were mine. My blood. And they were building a case against me. I began replaying memories with a sharper lens. One night, 2 months before he left for college, he'd come to my house unannounced. He was pale, breathing hard, like he'd run there. "Grandpa, can we talk?" he'd asked. I remember chuckling. "Of course we can talk. Since when do you need permission?" He sat at the table, tapping his foot, a habit his father used to have. I made him cocoa, and he wrapped both hands around the mug but didn't drink it. Then he whispered something I'd forgotten until now. "Do you ever feel like people treat you differently because of your age?" At the time, I thought he was talking about school. Teachers. Friends. I gave him the standard advice, that getting older is a strange privilege, that people expect wisdom but forget you're still human. He nodded, but he looked disappointed. He wasn't talking about age. He was talking about me. About how my own family had begun to categorize me. How they were speaking about me behind closed doors. How he'd overheard conversations I never would have believed possible. He tried to speak again but shut his mouth so tightly the muscles in his jaw twitched. "Grandpa, if anything weird starts happening, will you promise me something?" "What's that?" I asked. "Don't sign anything. Not without reading it twice." I'd laughed then. I thought it was adorable. I even told him, "You sound just like your grandmother." But he didn't laugh back. He just stared at the table, throat bobbing. Now, weeks later, holding that note, finding the recorder, discovering the forged documents. I realized he'd been trying to warn me before he even knew how to articulate what he'd seen. He had seen the cracks forming. He had seen the manipulation in its early stages. And he knew something else. I trusted my family too much. It happened 3 mornings later. I woke up before sunrise, not unusual, but the house felt stiff, unnatural. As if the air itself had been rearranged. In the kitchen. The chair I sit in was angled differently. The spice rack was reordered. My medication organizer was open. Open. I always close it. My blood ran cold. I checked the hallway camera. Playback showed nothing. But when I checked the living room camera, the file was corrupted. Corrupted. My grandson had been right. Someone was monitoring the house. Someone who knew how to delete only the footage that mattered. I checked the back door. Locked. But the rug, one corner folded. The exact corner that catches when the door shuts too fast. Someone had come in. Someone who wanted to look like they hadn't. Every instinct in my body sharpened, the way it had years ago when I worked night security to pay bills. The hairs on my arms rose. Even my breath felt out of place. That morning, I sat on my sofa and whispered into the quiet. "Okay. If you want to fight, you've chosen the wrong old man." I didn't call the police. I didn't confront anyone. Not yet. If they were building a case to prove I was confused, the worst thing I could do was react emotionally. I became methodical. First, I printed copies of the altered documents and stored them in 3 different places. My toolbox. The safe in the garage. A sealed envelope under my car seat. Second, I made a full inventory of the house. Every drawer. Every shelf. Every camera. Every password. Then I stretched blue painter's tape across the gap between doors and their frames, a trick my grandfather taught me. If any door opened even an inch, the tape would break. Third, I dusted the lids of my medication bottles with fine flour. A crude method, but effective. If someone opened them, I'd see the smudges. Fourth, I positioned my phone on silent and recorded for several hours while I slept. I placed it facing the hallway, turned off the lights, and pretended to snore once or twice. I couldn't trust the cameras anymore, but they didn't know that. By afternoon, I devised a plan to gather information without alerting anyone. I reached out to the lawyer I'd trusted for years, an old friend of Margaret's brother, and scheduled a quiet consultation. Then I sat in the living room and waited. You'd be surprised how long a man can wait when the truth is the only weapon he has left. At 7:26 p.m., my phone buzzed. Ethan, grandson, flashed on the screen. I answered immediately. His voice came low, urgent. Grandpa, are you alone? A chill ran through me. Yes, I said. At least I think so. He inhaled sharply. Okay. Listen. I don't have long. But you need to stop pretending nothing's wrong. My throat tightened. You wrote the note, I said quietly. Yes. Tell me what you know. He lowered his voice even more. Everything started last winter. I overheard Mom and Dad talking in the kitchen. They didn't know I was home. They said you've become difficult. That you don't listen. That you're slipping. They said taking over your finances was the only responsible thing to do. I didn't speak. He continued. It got worse. They met with someone, some guy named Steven. A lawyer, I think. They talked about transferring your assets. About conservatorship. About making sure you couldn't sabotage the transition. I clenched my jaw. They said you'd fight back. That's why they needed proof you weren't stable. They even talked about staging things. Hiding things. Moving stuff. Making you look confused so people would believe them. My chest tightened. And you? I asked. Why did you leave me the note? He exhaled shakily. Because I heard them say something else. Something I can't unhear. What was it? His voice cracked. They said, once everything was signed over, they'd move you into a care home. One of those places where people stop visiting after a week. I closed my eyes, the phone trembling in my hand. Grandpa, he whispered, I think they were planning to disappear you. Silence. Hard. Heavy. Real. And then he said. I'll help you. Whatever it takes. After his call ended, I sat in the dark living room, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional tick of the wall clock, everyday sounds that suddenly felt foreign. For years, I believed the danger in life came from the world outside. Strangers. Accidents. Time. I never imagined it would come from my blood. I stood, went to the closet, and pulled out the old cedar box Margaret kept letters in. Inside it was her wedding ring, our will, and the note she wrote when she was dying, the one where she told me. Protect what we built. Even from the hands that inherit it. Back then, I didn't understand. Now I did. The recorder wasn't the threat. The forged papers weren't the threat. The threat was the expectation that I would remain passive. Weak. Quiet. Easily rewritten. I took the recorder. I took the documents. And I took Margaret's ring for strength. Because I finally knew what I had to do. The next morning, I packed a bag and drove to meet the only lawyer I could still trust. I handed him everything, the recordings, the papers, the photographs, the timeline. He read through the evidence, leaned back, and said, "You're not paranoid. You're being targeted. And I can help you fight back." I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Control. "This won't be pretty," the lawyer warned. "You're going up against your own family." I nodded once. "They drew the first line," I said. "I'll draw the last one." My lawyer, Daniel Reeves, wasn't the kind of man who flinched at family conflict. He'd seen enough estate wars to know that blood rarely stays clean when money enters the room. But even he paused when he reviewed the documents I brought. "This isn't incompetence," he said. "This is a coordinated transfer of control." He pulled out a legal pad. "Tell me about your accounts." So I did: pensions, savings, the small investments Margaret and I had grown. Nothing extravagant. We were never rich. Just comfortable. Stable. Proud of what decades of hard work built. Daniel listened, then asked quietly, "When's the last time you personally checked your balances?" The question hit like a cold wave. 2 months ago, maybe. He opened his laptop, rotated it toward me. "Let's check now." The numbers flashed on the screen. My stomach turned. Several withdrawals. Large ones. Amounts I would never authorize, not even on my most generous day. I felt my pulse pounding in my temples. "Who has access?" Daniel asked. "My son," I said, swallowing hard. "He helps me pay bills sometimes." "Does he have your login information?" "Yes, he set it up after Margaret died." I didn't think. "You trusted him," Daniel finished. Trust. The most expensive currency a father can give. Daniel leaned back, rubbing his jaw. "Some of these transfers are routed through shell accounts. Whoever's behind this knew what they were doing." A sickness brewed in my chest. "Can we get the money back?" "Eventually," he said. "But the bigger issue is intent. Someone is preparing to show the court you're unfit. Once they do that, getting your rights back becomes nearly impossible." He looked me dead in the eye. "You need to protect yourself now." It felt strange hearing that. For years, I'd been the protector. The provider. The steady ground beneath my family's feet. And now I was the one who needed shelter from them. Daniel typed something quickly. "I'm filing an emergency motion to freeze all asset changes until we investigate further. This will keep them from moving more money." I nodded, but my hands trembled. He noticed. "I'm going to ask you a blunt question," he said. "Do you believe your family would lie to get control of everything?" I opened my mouth, ready to give the gentle, fatherly denial every man my age instinctively reaches for. But then I remembered. The recorder. The forged papers. The corrupted footage. The secret visits to the neighbor. The plan to move me into a care home. And worst of all, my grandson's terrified voice saying, "They were going to disappear you." So I answered truthfully. "Yes," I said. "I believe they would." Daniel nodded once. "Then let's make sure they fail." 2 days later, Daniel called me. "They're meeting without you," he said. My breath caught. "Who?" "Your son. His wife. 2 cousins. And the attorney they hired, Stevens." My grip tightened around the phone. "Where are they meeting?" "At your son's house. They think you're at home resting." Resting. The polite word people use before they try to bury you alive. "What are they talking about?" I asked. Daniel exhaled. "Everything you're afraid of. I have a source who overheard bits." My heartbeat pounded in my ears. He continued, voice steady. "They're preparing a petition claiming you're mentally declining. They're gathering anecdotal evidence, missed dates, repeated questions, moments of frustration, financial confusion. All fabricated, I said. Fabricated or staged, he replied. Either way, they plan to submit it next month. A heaviness pulled at my chest. What else? A care facility, Daniel said softly. They've already toured one. A locked memory unit. Very expensive. Paid directly from your accounts. My jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. They planned my removal, I whispered. While smiling at my dinner table. Daniel didn't sugarcoat it. They planned a takeover. And yes, they've been doing it for months. I felt the room tilt. Not from age. From betrayal. Then Daniel added something that ignited the fire in my bones. They also said they expect you to resist. They think you'll panic and prove their point. They're counting on emotional instability. I straightened slowly. They don't know me, I said. No, Daniel agreed. They think you're alone. But you're not. I swallowed hard. What do we do? We buy time. And we gather evidence. The more they push, the more we catch. Your grandson was right, they've been laying groundwork. Now we flip it. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to strength. Not the strength of youth. The strength of survival. The kind that grows in men who've lost and still continued on. I thanked Daniel and hung up. Then I sat quietly, staring at the walls of the house I built. Walls that now felt like they were listening, and made a promise. If they wanted a case, I'd give them one. Not proving that I was unfit. Proving that they were dangerous. The following Sunday, my daughter-in-law, Marcy, showed up with a casserole. She smiled too wide. Her eyes darted. Her voice carried the softness of a woman pretending to care. Thought you might like something warm, Dad, she said, placing it on the counter. I nodded politely, watching her hands. They trembled, just slightly. Hard week? I asked. She blinked. Why do you say that? You look tired. A crack appeared in her expression, too quick for her to hide. She forced a laugh. Just busy. You know how it is. But I noticed something else. She kept glancing at my medication tray. I sorted them already, I said lightly. Another crack. Oh, she said, stepping back. Good. I wasn't sure. That was the moment I realized she wasn't here to bring food. She was here to check if her earlier tampering had worked. I approached the tray casually, lifted a bottle. The lid was slightly misaligned. Only a fraction, but I'd set a trap days earlier. Flour dust. Only visible when touched. And 3 bottles had prints. She followed my gaze. Her throat bobbed. Something wrong? She asked too quickly. No, I said gently. Just making sure everything's in order. She smiled again, but her cheeks had gone pale. Okay then. I'll get going. She hurried out the door. She knew. She'd realized I knew. And that mistake meant everything. Because the kind of people who think they're winning always slip first. I opened my notebook and wrote down the exact time, date, and details. Another piece of evidence. And my daughter-in-law. She had no idea she'd just turned the tide. It was 1:17 a.m. A sound pulled me out of sleep, soft, cautious footsteps crossing the hallway. Not the old house settling. Not pipes or wind. A person. Moving slowly. I reached for the phone. Recorded video. Stayed quiet. The steps paused near my bedroom door. My breath stilled. A shadow slipped under the doorframe, just enough to confirm someone was standing there. Listening. I waited. And then, the doorknob turned. Not fully. Just a test. A gentle pressure. I sat upright, every muscle tight, ready. Footsteps retreated quickly down the hall. I waited a full minute. Then 2. Then 5. When I stepped into the hallway, it was empty. But the blue painter's tape across the basement door frame. Broken. Not torn accidentally. Split clean through, like someone opened it carefully. I walked to the basement, heart pounding. Flicked on the light. Nothing looked out of place. Except the cardboard box on the top shelf, the one containing my old financial ledgers, had been moved an inch forward. Just 1 inch. Someone was looking for documentation. Proof. History. Someone who needed to reshape my past to justify stealing my future. I locked the basement door from the inside, climbed back upstairs, and sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee until daylight. The house wasn't mine anymore. It was a chessboard. And every quiet step in the night was another move. 2 days later, Daniel called me again. I found something, he said. And it's big. I braced myself. There's an account under your name, he explained. An account you've never seen. It was opened 3 months ago with your forged signature. My stomach dropped. Activity? I asked. Yes. Large deposits. All matching the withdrawals from your real accounts. I felt the floor tilt. So they're draining my funds into a fake account, I whispered. Daniel exhaled. Yes. And the worst part? They've been using that account to pay for services connected to guardianship proceedings. My voice cracked. They're using my money, to strip me of my rights. I'm afraid so, he said softly. But now we have proof of criminal activity. Fraud. Identity manipulation. Unauthorized financial movement. I sat down, gripping the edge of the table. Can we stop them? We can expose them, Daniel answered. But I need more. This isn't just incompetence, it's conspiracy. The word hung in the air. Conspiracy. And it fit too well. I remembered the whispered phone call. The forged documents. The erased camera footage. The nighttime footsteps. All of it part of a pattern. A structure. A plan. Daniel, I said slowly, how do we prove intent? You catch them in the act, he replied. Or better yet. You make them believe you're still vulnerable. Still blind. Still predictable. So they move again. And when they do, you're ready. In the midst of all the chaos, I kept returning to a memory I'd tried to bury. It was Margaret's final week. She was thin, fragile, but her voice had strength even cancer couldn't kill. She held my hand, eyes soft but sharp. Promise me something, she whispered. Anything. When I'm gone, don't let loneliness make you blind. I frowned. Blind to what? To the difference between love and control. I almost laughed. Our family loves us. She squeezed my hand, weak but insistent. Love makes room, she whispered. Control makes plans. I brushed her hair back. You're overthinking. No, she said. I'm seeing clearly for the first time. Her eyes were glassy with tears, but her voice remained steady. One day, Tom, someone will try to make decisions for you. Not out of kindness. But out of convenience. I shook my head, refusing the idea. Not our children. Especially our children, she said. Because they know what you have. And because they know you trust them. I swallowed hard. I'm telling you this, she said, voice fading, so you'll recognize the moment when it comes. Her hand trembled. And Tom, that moment won't knock on your door. It will move in silently. Change your home. Touch your things. Rewrite your world. You must stay awake. I kissed her forehead. I'll be fine. She closed her eyes. Just promise you'll see. For years, I ignored those words. Now they rang louder than any truth I'd ever heard. It was a gray, drizzly afternoon when someone knocked at my door. When I opened it, lightning cracked somewhere far off. My grandson stood there. Wet hair. Backpack half open. Breathing hard like he'd run from the bus stop. Ethan. I whispered. What are you doing here? He stepped inside quickly, shutting the door. They know you're resisting, he said, voice trembling. They know you're talking to someone, they're trying to speed everything up. My chest tightened. How do you know? I overheard them again. Dad was on the phone last night. He said, we need the paperwork filed within 2 weeks. Before he catches on. 2 weeks. That was nothing. I thought you were supposed to be at school, I said. I left, he said simply. I withdrew for the semester. I stared at him, stunned. You shouldn't have done that. You need your education. I need you alive, he said, voice cracking. The weight of that sentence hit harder than anything so far. He dropped his backpack on the floor and pulled out a folder, thick, stuffed, rubber-banded. What's that? I asked. Everything I found. Emails. Printed messages. Bank screenshots. Notes from meetings they didn't know I overheard. Names of lawyers. Dates. Times. He placed the folder in my hands. I'm not letting them do this to you, he said. My throat tightened until I could barely breathe. Ethan, this could get you in trouble. He shook his head. I don't care. I'm not losing another grandparent to silence. Those words hit deep. He had watched his family tear itself apart after Margaret died. He had seen loyalties shift. He had seen people change. He had seen what I couldn't see. And now he was fighting for me. I placed a hand on his shoulder. You're a good boy, I whispered. He looked away. I'm not doing this to be good. I'm doing it because they're wrong. The rain hit the windows harder. The storm outside felt synchronized with the storm inside. We have to move fast, he said. Before they take everything. I nodded slowly. Then let's move, I said. And for the first time in weeks. I didn't feel alone. Daniel's words echoed in my mind. You catch them in the act. So that's what I plan to do. Ethan and I sat at my dining room table, the same table where Margaret once served Sunday dinner, and began designing a strategy. A quiet one. A believable one. A trap. We needed them to reveal their intent in a way that couldn't be explained away. Something undeniable. Grandpa, Ethan said, leaning in, what if we give them an opening? Something they think they can use. I raised an eyebrow. Like what? A moment of confusion, he said. Something small. Something they'll rush to document. Dangerous. Risky. But effective. What if they push too far? I asked. That's the point, he said. We'll be recording everything. So we planned. We adjusted security cameras. We placed hidden audio devices. We set alerts that pinged Daniel in real time. Then we staged a scenario. One afternoon, I left a set of important documents scattered on the kitchen table, papers that hinted at asset redistribution. Then Ethan accidentally mentioned to my son that I'd been feeling overwhelmed lately. We waited less than 24 hours. They came. Not together, that would be too obvious. But in shifts. My daughter-in-law first. Pretending to check in. My cousin next. Pretending to bring mail. My son last. Pretending to help organize. Each one walked straight to the kitchen table. Each one photographed the documents. Each one whispered something into their phone. Every whisper caught on audio. Every movement caught on hidden cameras. But the moment that sealed their fate. My son kneeling beside my chair, speaking with a tenderness that was so artificial it left a sour taste in the air. "Dad, I know you're trying your best, but it's okay if this is getting too hard for you." He squeezed my shoulder like a nurse comforting a patient. "You don't have to handle things anymore. We'll take care of everything. Just sign what we prepared." He slid a folder toward me. I didn't touch it. I didn't have to. Every word was being recorded. Every gesture. Every manipulation. Ethan watched from the hallway, jaw clenched. And then my son said it. "You're not making decisions anymore. We are." That sentence was the bullet they fired into their own case. I smiled gently, pretending not to understand. "Is that so?" I whispered. He nodded, pitying me. "Yes, Dad. It's time." I looked at him with the softness of a man who has already dug the grave for the people trying to bury him. "All right," I said. His eyes lit with victory. But the victory wasn't his. It was mine. Because they had just stepped directly into the trap. And they didn't even know it. There's a particular hush that falls over a town the moment the police slide a notice under someone's door. It wasn't the noise that surprised me, it was how ordinary the law looked when it arrived: plain suits, taped evidence bags, and the flat, precise language of warrants. There were no dramatic standoffs. No shouting. Just careful movements, clips, and paperwork. They treated the scene like the domestic crime it was, intimate and slow, not cinematic. My son's house was a house like any other in the cul-de-sac until men with badges stood at the gate. They did what the law does best, they followed a paper trail no one could prettify. The shell accounts, the fraudulent transfers, the forged signatures, each one folded into exhibits. The cousin's laptop hummed from an evidence bag. The accountant's ledger smelled faintly of coffee and fear. There was no one dramatic speech. There were only documents and people who had been careless in their small, human ways, leaving metadata, reusing vendor names, and dropping their guard. When an officer took my son's arm, his face changed the way a mask falls. I had often imagined this moment and never once pictured the simple decline in his eyes. He was led away, polite, bewildered, like a man who'd been risen up to meet the consequences he thought he could avoid. News vans arrived with that strange hunger the cameras have, a mix of duty and appetite. The anchors framed the story the way a meat cutter frames the night's best cut, precise, practiced, and designed to keep eyes. Elder exploitation, they said. Family embezzlement. My name slid across lower thirds as if the text itself could weigh what I'd felt for months. I stood on my porch and watched it all as if from a distance. Not because I felt detached, but because the scale of being betrayed by those closest to you cannot be held in one single moment. It accumulates. People at the diner folded their hands and said, quietly, "I never thought he'd do such a thing." The ones who knew my family best behaved worst, stunned by the proof, surprised by the ordinary arithmetic of greed. Others called in with condolences and offers of soup. The phone rang until my grandson turned it off. For a while there was nothing I could do but let the reality of the arrest settle into the world like dust. But a legal process is a slow machine. Arrests were the first teeth. Trials would be the long jaws. Still, the arrests changed something fundamental, they turned the private theft into public fact. You can lie behind closed doors, but not when the court files open the window wide. That night, the house felt lighter, not because the damage had been fixed, but because the world had acknowledged it existed. A recognition can be a kind of medicine. Courtrooms have a rhythm all their own, the rustle of paper, the low murmur of counsel conferring, the scrape of shoes. The day of the arraignment, the room smelled faintly of coffee and cleaned linoleum. The prosecutor wore a look that made you trust her the way you trust a precise instrument. She had been given a stack of evidence and a mandate to make a private crime public. When she read the emails in court, I felt the world tilt in a way I will never be able to describe fully. It wasn't the content alone, though reading someone's plans to move assets in black and white is cold enough, it was the ordinariness of the language. Once he signs, we'll transfer after the appointment, keep everything calm. Words meant for planning grocery lists suddenly sounded like malice. They read the recordings, too. My voice, small, warm, human, reverberated through the courtroom speakers. Margaret always told me to be careful with the windows. Then the son's reply, we'll take care of it. Don't worry. The jury watched faces, watched hands, watched the man who once held my shoulder. The defense tried what every defense tries in such cases: confusion, context, the terror of misinterpretation. They argued about intent. They said love is complicated. They tried to tug pity into the record. But when a judge heard a man's recorded voice describe how to fabricate documents and when an accountant's metadata showed identical IP addresses used at odd hours, there was nowhere for the defense to go. Evidence is not righteous. Evidence is true in its bluntness. It says nothing about sorrow or apology. It only says, this happened. At one point, the prosecutor paused and looked directly at my son. Did you manipulate the documents? She asked. He looked down, then up. We were trying to keep the family safe, he said. For whose safety? She pressed. For, he faltered. The words didn't land because the documents did. The jury took its time. They examined ledgers, scanned invoices, and listened to recordings of late-night conversations. The way the prosecutor organized the evidence was not dramatic, it was surgical. She showed how money moved, how signatures were falsified, how care facilities were discussed as if they were logistics. When the verdict came, guilty on multiple counts of financial exploitation and fraud, it opened a strangled thing in me I had not expected. Not joy. Relief, maybe. Not vindication. A sadness for the cost of truth. The sentencing would come later. There would be restitution hearings, frozen funds, civil suits, and a mountain of paperwork. But the court had cut off the head of the plan. The law had moved. The system, slow, imperfect, legal, had done what it was designed to do when clear proof is laid before it. Walking out of the courthouse that day, I felt something like exhaustion and also, strangely, like air. The old appetite for justice isn't revenge. It's the righting of a wrong that struck at your bones. Justice in the courtroom is a beginning, not a cure. There were hearings to prevent asset drain, orders for restitution, and negotiators who seemed to live in a twilight zone of spreadsheets and family meetings. The banks released some funds, froze others, and auditors spent long days combing accounts. The ledger that had once looked like a labyrinth became, painfully, something that could be retraced. We changed locks. We installed systems that could not be casually overridden. Daniel argued for two-factor authentication, for hard copies, for multiple signatories. We created a plan for financial oversight that involved lawyers and local friends, people outside the family who had no reason to be anything but objective. There was paperwork at every turn. I sat at the kitchen table and watched Margaret's wedding photo like a talisman while Daniel made calls. The small acts of security felt like a betrayal to the life I'd had, like admitting my family had been untrustworthy. But those acts were necessary. They were the stitches that would keep the wound from widening. Restitution hearings were strange theater. We presented case by case, the transfers traced, the shell companies exposed. Their defense lawyers argued about intent, our prosecutors argued about consequence. The court ordered a freeze, then a reallocation to legally managed accounts until restitution could be sorted. It was slow, bureaucratic, but it was movement in the right direction. Neighbors brought casseroles. Margaret's church offered to help with lawn care. Small things. Witnesses came forward with notes they'd kept in kitchen drawers. The public shame that had wrapped itself around my family loosened by degrees as people realized responsibility sometimes comes in paperwork and testimony. As money returned, a little at a time, the practical matters mattered less than the psychological ones. There was a moment when I unlocked my front door with my own key and the house smelled, not of threat, but of possibility. Not everything could be repaired. You can't put back a childhood unspent or a trust that was eroded. But you can secure what's left. I set Margaret's teacup back on the shelf in the exact place it had always been and sat down. My grandson came into the kitchen, messy hair and solemn face. He sat across from me and passed me a mug. "We did it," he said simply. "We did. Not just for me, but for the truth." My grandson changed in a way that had nothing to do with being forced home from school. He grew a kind of seriousness you don't get from study halls. He had been a boy who liked the quick joke, the shortcut through life. Now he moved with a purpose, an adult's attention, and an older man's care in his hands. He spent hours with auditors, sitting quietly while numbers were explained. He learned the language of transfers, of traceable receipts, of IP addresses. He sat through depositions and came home with a sleepiness that wasn't just from work, it was from the weight of truth. One night he found an old envelope in the toolbox where I'd hidden some copies of documents. The envelope was stamped, "For Grandpa," in my daughter's handwriting when she was a child. He opened it and found drawings and a letter from his mother when she was small, a promise to always take care of family. He read it to me with a voice that wavered. "You think she meant that?" he asked. "I don't know," I said. "People mean what they can at the moment they can." He nodded, eyes bright with a grown understanding. "You taught me something," he said later, sitting on the porch steps, watching the dusk. "You taught me to notice small things, the way you do. You taught me how to be patient." He had learned courage in ways I hadn't expected. We had become a team. He would go back to school one day. The prosecutor said he might qualify for a scholarship program because of his assistance. But for now, his presence at the table mattered more than his tuition. He had chosen to protect what we had left. He didn't want accolades. He wanted quiet. He wanted to study and grow, to make sure no one else could be tricked like we had been. And the change in him, from a college kid into a man who helped drag secrets into the light, was one of the few beautiful things to rise from all this. It would have been cleaner if the family simply fell apart in a single moment, but sorrow tends to be more complicated. Some relatives begged for forgiveness in ways that sounded rehearsed. Others disappeared entirely, choosing distance over accountability. The cousin quietly moved away, their names scrubbed from family photos. The accountant fought the charges and hired a litany of lawyers. My son spent nights in a holding pattern of calls and counsel. There were difficult conversations, not the performative ones for the camera, but the hard ones in the kitchen with lawyers present. My daughter-in-law called once and then never again. Some kept putting on a face of normalcy until the court made it impossible. Others showed up at hearings with hollow eyes, and I saw the faces of people trying to rebuild a life around shame. You can't force someone to repent. You can only ask them to own what they did. Some did. Some didn't. For me, the painful truth was not the loss of their company so much as the loss of the image of them I had carried for decades. It's a slow grieving, akin to the grieving for a person who has not yet died but who has changed in a way that cannot be repaired. My neighborhood friends told me to be careful with invitations. "Let them come by when they can offer something real," said Henry, my neighbor. I smiled, grateful for small counsels. We made room for those who wanted to rebuild and set boundaries for those who didn't. It was not cruel. It was practical. Freedom to live without being carved away by the people who should have protected you is not vengeance, it's survival. Lawyers tend to speak a language that feels like arithmetic for grief. In court, restitution hearings are the moments when the ledger of pain opens and numbers try to stand in for the life that was intruded upon. The judge listened to detailed accounts, the transfers, the shell companies, the invoices, and then the slow arithmetic of what could be returned began. They didn't award us fairy tale sums overnight. Restitution is bartered in steps. Accounts were frozen. Houses temporarily encumbered. Some money came back. Some was already spent into shapes no court could recompose. The judge ordered an aggressive repayment plan, asset liquidations were necessary, and set a structured supervision for future withdrawals. The hardest part was watching lawyers negotiate the right percentages to return, as if apology could be balanced on a spreadsheet. But numbers matter, they buy time, they return control, they allow a man to sleep without wondering where the next deduction will come. During the hearings, a woman from the prosecution's team read a victim impact statement I had written the night before. Standing in the courtroom, listening to my own voice explain the small losses, of trust, of quiet nights, of a life rearranged, felt strange and relieving. It made the private public in a way that couldn't be dismissed by a sympathetic smile. The judge's face was old and kind. He looked at the accused and then at me. "I will order restitution where possible," he said, and impose terms to protect the victim. It was not a miracle. It was a legal order. But it carried weight. I watched my grandson hold my hand through it all. He squeezed once, a small anchor. The court would not heal everything, but it had built me a scaffolding from which to rebuild. There is a morning you remember. The one when you take a breath and realize you're no longer scanning for footsteps. It took weeks for that morning to arrive. Once the court had acted and bail conditions were in place, there came a dawn when I made tea and didn't check the locks twice. The sun slatted through the blinds in a way that seemed to wash the house in a different color. I walked through the room slowly, touching the mantel and the spots on the wall where our life had always hung. The photographs didn't glare at me now. They were simply photographs. The house exhaled. My grandson hummed in the next room as he organized files. He'd bought a new notebook for his class and had scribbled a plan to go back in the fall. I thought about Margaret and the promise she gave me in those final days, to be watchful. I had kept that promise in the way he had taught me, by learning to look twice and to never mistake convenience for care. Henry stopped by with a pot of coffee and a grin that was both neighborly and conspiratorial. "You look like a man who slept," he said. I think I did. I smiled back honestly. There are practical things to fix, a gate that needs mending, a wire fence to fortify, but the largest repairs are not physical. They are internal. The quiet that remained was not the silence of fear but the silence of being home. The trial and subsequent hearings closed a door but opened another, one where truth sets the terms and the living can move forward. Sitting in my kitchen, watching my grandson draw a plan for his return to school, I felt the slow uncoiling of something that had been knotted tight for months. We'd won more than legal certificates. We'd reclaimed dignity. The judge's orders meant more than money, they meant that the system acknowledged the harm and did something about it. It doesn't always happen that way. The law is not perfect. But in our case, evidence laid plainly, and truth found a path. My son and others faced the consequences. They would have time to think, to seek counsel, and perhaps to rebuild lives separate from mine. Some would try to fix what they had broken. Some would not. That was not mine to decide. We repaired locks, replaced passwords, and taught the grandchildren about vigilance without fear. We had conversations about how easy trust can be weaponized and how important it is to guard not only bank accounts but boundaries. I told stories about tools and patience and how to notice small things that matter. One morning, the granddaughter, who had been so brave and so painfully young in all this, left a drawing on the fridge, 2 people by a pond, a grandfather and a boy. It was simple. It said, in its own language, that she trusted us again. I thought about the note he'd left under the desk, the one that started all this. They listen. They watch. He had been right. But he had also proved something else, a small voice, if brave, can move mountains. If you've watched this story to the end. If you sat with a man whose family turned against him and then watched him take careful steps toward truth, then you know why I fought. Not for revenge. Not even for money. I fought to be seen. To remain. To wake up one morning and not flinch. If this story taught you something, share it. Tell someone who trusts too easily to look twice. Hit subscribe if you believe small voices deserve to be heard and quiet men should not be plucked from their lives. We bent, we broke, and we rebuilt. The house is mended enough to hold memory without fracture. The grandchildren visit with laughter that no court can subpoena. Sometimes I sit and listen to them, and I know why I kept fighting, because being erased is more than losing things, it's losing what it means to exist in the lives you built. And for now, I exist.